The year was 1881, and the wind across the high plains spoke a language only the lonely could understand. Arthur McBride, a weathered rancher living alone on his isolated land, had come to recognize its voice. It whispered through the worn slats of his cabin and rattled the glass pane he had once proudly carried back from town a decade ago. It wasn't just wind, it was memory, it was sorrow, and it carried with it the ghosts of everything he had lost. 7 years had passed since Arthur buried his wife, Martha, and their young son, Tom, in the dry earth behind the house. Fever had taken them like a fire burning across the prairie, ruthless and without mercy. Since that day, Arthur's life had shrunk to his modest ranch, a piece of stubborn land that gave little and demanded much. He spoke only to his horse, to the wind, or to the occasional trader at the nearest settlement, 2 days' ride away. The silence of his days had weight, heavy and unmoving. The silence of a man who had stopped expecting anything more from the world. But that quiet was about to be broken. It was late afternoon, and the sky had taken on the bruised hue of impending night. Arthur was forking hay in his barn, tending to his aging mare Bess, when something moved in the shadows a flicker, just enough to catch his eye. He froze, pitchfork held midair. Coyote? Bobcat, maybe. But as he stepped closer, boots brushing against the packed earth floor, he realized it wasn't an animal nut, the four-legged kind. Curled up in the back corner of a vacant stall was a girl. She looked no older than 15 or 16, with tangled black hair falling across a face streaked with fear and fatigue. Her dress, made of soft hide, was torn and dirty, and the beadwork on her worn moccasins told Arthur what he needed to know. Kiowa. The blood on her sleeve told him more. She was running from something or someone. Her eyes, wide and dark, like a deer caught in the open, locked onto his. She trembled violently, every muscle ready to spring. Arthur didn't lower the pitchfork immediately. In this part of the world, trouble often came quietly. But as he looked at her, bruised and exhausted in the dim barn light, something deeper stirred in him. He hadn't felt it in years. Not compassion, at least not yet. It was recognition. She didn't belong here, and neither did he. Both were out of place, out of time. "You ain't supposed to be here," he said gruffly, voice cracking from disuse. The girl flinched, shrinking into the shadows. Arthur saw her hands clench, ready to bolt. He hesitated. It would have been easier to send her away. Safer, too. But as the image of Martha's face flickered through his memory, her quiet trust. Even in her final hours, he felt that old knot of sorrow tighten in his chest. The girl's eyes, they held the same haunted look Tom once had, the same innocence touched by fear. "Reckon you're in some kind of fix," he muttered under his breath. Then, slowly, he backed away. "Stay put," he said. "Don't run." He left the barn, his thoughts tangled. This was trouble, no doubt. But when he returned with a dipper of water and a piece of leftover cornbread, she hadn't moved. Her gaze still followed him, cautious, unreadable. Arthur set the food down a few feet from her and stepped back. "Here," he said, gesturing. She hesitated, clearly torn between fear and hunger. At last, her thin hand reached out. The water sloshed as she drank. The cornbread disappeared in seconds. Arthur watched in silence. "I wasn't sure what he'd done or why." She said nothing. Neither did he, but something had changed. The wind that had always carried loneliness now carried something else, possibility, fragile, dangerous, and very, very human. The next morning, Arthur awoke with the rising sun streaking gold across his cabin floor. For a moment, the events of the previous evening felt like something conjured by loneliness. But when he opened the barn door and saw her again curled under a blanket of hay, the water tipper resting beside her, he knew it was real. She hadn't run. Arthur kept his distance. He didn't want to startle her. He just nodded and went about his chores, feeding Bess, checking the well, patching a fence. The wind had bullied loose again. But every action felt different now. The silence wasn't just his own anymore. Later, that afternoon, he returned to the barn with another small offering, a tin cup of weak coffee and a slice of jerky. She was awake, though still wary. When she saw him approach, she sat up, alert, but not retreating. He placed the food on the ground, a few feet away, and turned away, pretending to inspect a bridle on the wall. She moved slowly, cautiously, took the cup, drank, ate, still silent. Arthur watched her from the corner of his eye. There was something wild about her, something feral, like a fox that had narrowly escaped a trap and wasn't sure it was free. She moved like someone who expected violence at any moment. He didn't ask questions. What good would they do? She likely didn't speak much English, and he had no knowledge of her language. But as the days passed, a pattern emerged. She stayed hidden in the barn, emerging only to gather water or stretch her legs when Arthur was far enough away. He learned her name accidentally. One morning, she walked back toward the house with a bucket of water. He heard her murmur something softly to herself. It wasn't in English, but the way she whispered "Itas," though, to remind herself who she was, caught his attention. Mesa. Arthur said nothing. Okay, but he didn't forget it. Each day, he left food near the stall. Sometimes, he caught a glimpse of her, brushing her hair with her fingers, or trying to repair her torn clothing using thread pulled from a feed sack. One day, he placed a clean horse blanket near the stall, folded and waiting. The next day, it was gone. He began speaking aloud, more not to her, but around her, naming things. Lamp, he'd say, lighting the old oil lamp. Stove, spoon, water. He wasn't sure she understood, but he did it anyway. One afternoon, something shifted. Bess, the old mare, was pawing at the ground, agitated. A burr had gotten tangled in her forelock, and she kept tossing her head. Arthur was about to step forward to calm her when he saw a blur of movement from the shadows. Mesa. She moved without hesitation. Softly, carefully, she approached the horse. Her hands were delicate but practiced. She murmured something too low to understand, and astonishingly, Bess calmed. Arthur stood still, barely breathing. He watched as Mesa gently worked the burr from the horse's hair. She patted Bess's neck, whispering in her own tongue, her expression softened by the moment. For the first time, Arthur saw more than a frightened runaway. He saw a girl with grace, with patience, with a hidden strength. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to after that day. Her presence felt less like a disruption and more like a part of the land itself. The barn didn't seem as empty. The long afternoons didn't stretch quite so wide. And in the evenings, when he sat alone in the cabin, sometimes found himself listening for the quiet scuffle of her footsteps in the hay. It was a strange kind of companionship, wordless, fragile, but real. He began leaving small things, for her hand apple from a crate, a patched shawl, a better tin cup. She accepted them without thanks. He expected none. Arthur told himself this wasn't about caring. It was about decency. It's about not letting a girl freeze or starve on his land. That was all. But deep down, something, old and stubborn, was beginning to shift inside him. He wasn't sure if it was hope, but it was something close. The land had grown colder, and so had Arthur's thoughts, though the sun still climbed each morning. There was a bite in the wind that told of an early frost. Each day felt heavier. Isa still stayed mostly in the barn, but the distance between them had lessened, if only by degrees. She no longer flinched at his footsteps. She watched him with calm eyes. And once, when their hands brushed at the water bucket, she didn't pull away. Arthur didn't speak much. He wasn't sure what to say, but in her presence, the house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt waiting. somehow. Still, he had no illusions. He knew danger wasn't far behind her, and it came one morning with the sound of hooves. Arthur was out tending a fence line near a dry creek bed when he spotted them. 3 riders moving with grim determination across the prairie. They were too distant to make out clearly, but Arthur had lived long enough to know a search party when he saw one. They weren't white settlers. They were native warriors, and their path cut straight for his ranch. He rode hard for home, his thoughts racing. By the time he reached the barn, Mesa had already seen them. She was climbing into the loft, her face pale with panic. "No," Arthur said, sharper than he meant. "Not up there. It's the first place they'll look." She froze, eyes wide. "There's a root cellar. Come with me." She hesitated, torn between fight and flight. He grabbed her wrist knot, rough, just firm. "Trust me." The words were strange in his mouth. He hadn't asked anyone to trust him in years. He led her to the small root cellar beneath, a cabin more a crawl space than anything else. Dark, cramped, cold, but it would have to do. She slipped inside without a word. He closed the wooden trapdoor and covered it with a rug. Then he waited. The riders arrived just past noon. 3 of them mounted on lean, tireless ponies. Warriors, no doubt. Their faces were painted, stern and unreadable. The lead rider, tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar across his cheek, looked directly at Arthur as he dismounted. His voice was low but firm. "She came this way." Arthur said nothing. "Tracks, small feet, moccasin prints near your well. She is Kiowa. Her name is Mesa." Arthur didn't blink. "You're welcome to water your horses. Tin, I'd thank you to be on your way. This is private land." The leader Vulcan Arthur would later learn smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. "We will search her buildings," he said. "If she is here, we will find her. If you help her, you are our enemy." The threat sat heavy in the air. Arthur felt the chill of it, bone deep. He stood straighter, sting the rifle in his hands, not aiming it, but making it clear he knew how to use it. "You are one man," Vulcan said, voice almost amused. "We are 3. Arthur's voice didn't rise. "It's still my land, and she's not here." Vulcan studied him, saw the age in his face. Yes, but also the steadiness in his hands, the firmness in his stance. He wasn't a young man, but he wasn't a man who would give easily. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, finally, Vulcan made a small gesture with his hand. The warriors mounted their ponies. They didn't argue, didn't search. But they didn't take their eyes off Arthur until they were specks on the southern horizon. Only when they were gone did Arthur exhale. His hands were trembling. He went inside and pulled back the trapdoor. Mesa blinked up at him, her face tight with fear and sweat. "They're gone," he said. "For now." She climbed out slowly. He offered her water. She drank, then sat on the floor, legs pulled tightly to her chest. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. She looked at him then. Really looked, hand nodded once. It was the beginning of something fragile and unspoken in that moment. Arthur understood. She hadn't just been running from her people. She'd been running from whatever fate they had chosen for her. And now, for better or worse, she was his responsibility. After the first confrontation, something shifted between Arthur and Mesa. She no longer kept strictly to the barn. Gradually, hesitantly, she began to spend more time near the cabin first, in the mornings, tending to the trough or brushing Bess's coat. Then in the afternoons, sitting near the porch with a small bundle of thread and cloth in her lap, mending what little she had. Arthur didn't press her. He simply made room. A second bowl at mealtime, extra chair. The door to the spare room, intended long ago for a child who never had the chance to grow up, remained open. Inside it, Mesa began to sleep. She spoke more now, her English halting but steady. Arthur, in turn, picked up a few Kiowa words. Paya, water, Tony, food, Soka horse. They spoke in fragments, in gestures, in patience. It was enough. Sometimes, in the evenings, Arthur would read aloud from a tattered book, more for the sound of a human voice than the content. Mesa listened, her fingers busy weaving strands of horsehair into patterns or sketching with charcoal on scraps of wood. One night, during a storm that howled through the plains like an angry ghost, they huddled in the cabin together. The snow piled high against the walls. The wind shook the windows, but inside, by the stove's gentle heat, it was warm. Mesa sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing. She showed him what she'd sketched. A horse, fierce and wild, galloping across open land. Arthur blinked. "That's good," he said, his voice thick. "Very good." She smiled. A real smile, unafraid, and in that moment, he saw. Not a runaway, not a fugitive, but a young woman with a future. A future she might now live to see. But peace is always temporary on the frontier. It happened on a bright May morning. Arthur was repairing the corral fence. Mesa was in the small garden she'd begun behind the cabin, coaxing fragile shoots from the stubborn soil. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, several. Fast, he turned. 4 riders. All Kiowa. One of them was Vulcan. They weren't just passing through, they were here for war. Inside. Arthur shouted. Mesa looked up, startled, then ran for the house. Arthur grabbed his rifle and took position near the front steps. His breath came fast. His hands were steady. Vulcan reined in his horse 20 yards away. He didn't dismount. "You lied?" he called out. "She is here." Arthur said nothing. "If you stand with her, you will fall with her." Vulcan's rifle lifted slightly. Arthur didn't hesitate. He fired not at Vulcan, but at his horse's feet. The shot struck dirt, and the startled animal reared, sending Vulcan tumbling. Gunfire erupted. Bullets split the air. One whizzed past Arthur's ear. Another shattered a window. Arthur ducked, rolled behind the trough, and returned fire. He was no soldier. But he was angry, and he was determined. Then another sound. More hooves. Coming fast. From the east, over the ridge, came half a dozen riders. Ranchers, neighbors, men. Arthur had once shared bitter coffee and hard winters with, at their head, Caleb Weston. Arthur hadn't seen him in 2 years. The reinforcements changed everything. The Kiowa warriors hesitated, then turned. Vulcan climbed back onto his horse. The group wheeled around and fled, West disappearing into the rolling dust like shadows, in retreat. Arthur stood slowly, lowering his rifle. His hands were shaking. His chest burned with exertion. Caleb dismounted, eyes scanning the damage. "You all right, Arthur?" Arthur nodded. "I saw them cutting west earlier," Caleb said. "Had a feeling. Glad you followed it," Arthur replied, voice hoarse. Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. It was the most they'd spoken in years. That night, the house felt different, not just safer, but acknowledged. No Nessa came out of the spare room and sat beside Arthur on the porch. The sunset bled orange and violet across the endless horizon. "I should leave," she whispered. "More will come." Arthur looked at her, the lines of her face made older by survival. "This is your home now," he said softly. "You want it to be." She turned to him, uncertain, even if more trouble. He gave a tired smile. "Trouble finds us no matter where we go." She didn't reply, but she stayed, and Arthur felt for the first time in years not alone, not a ghost, but a man among the living again. The days that followed were quiet, though the memory of gunfire lingered like smoke in the corners of Arthur's cabin. His hearing had dulled from the fight, but not his awareness. He kept his rifle close now, checked the horizon more often, watched the path that led toward the distant hills, as if waiting for a shadow that might return. But no riders came. Mesa remained. She took to the routines of ranch life with a kind of quiet purpose. Her hands, once trembling, now held strength as she tended to the garden or brushed down Bess. She learned to churn butter, to mend a saddle strap, to pour coffee without spilling. Arthur taught her what he knew, not like a teacher, but like a man relearning how to speak. She listened carefully, repeated his words, then taught him her own tap wine. She said one morning, pointing to the sky. Arthur looked up. Cloud. She nodded, smiling, and just like that, they built a language of their own, part Kiowa, part English, part shared silence. It was enough. Men from the surrounding settlements began stopping by, not in large numbers, and not with questions, but with quiet gestures. One brought nails, another left a bag of seed. They had heard what Arthur had done, and though not all of them understood it, they respected it. That was how frontier trust worked, through actions, not explanations. Mesa, too, found her place. Children from neighboring farms began leaving small gifts near the edge of the property. Carved toy, a ribbon, a single wildflower. One girl her age even waved from a wagon and smiled. The hunted look faded from her eyes. One afternoon, Arthur found her standing in front of the cabin, staring at the mountains in the distance. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" she asked. Arthur paused, then said honestly, "Maybe." Mesa turned to him. "Would you still protect me, even if it meant dying?" He looked at her for a long moment. In her face, he saw not just the girl who had once cowered in his barn, but the woman she was becoming, steady, strong, unbroken. "I already did," he replied simply. Mesa didn't cry, but her eyes shone with something close. That night, they shared supper at the wooden table, 2 bowls, 2 chairs, and the soft crackle of the fire between them. After the meal, she picked up the small wooden panel she had been carving for weeks. It was a scene, rough but unmistakable. A cabin, a horse, 2 figures on the porch. One tall, one small, both facing west into the sunset. She handed it to Arthur without a word. He traced the edges with his calloused fingers. "It's beautiful," he said. She looked down, her voice almost a whisper. "This is home now, if you'll have me." Arthur blinked. The words hit him with more force than he expected. No one had said home to him in years, not since Martha, not since Tom. He nodded. "I want that," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. He didn't bother hiding. "I do." The seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer. The prairie bloomed in cautious color. Dang, autumn came, golden and dry, the air crisp and forgiving. Arthur's ranch, once a fortress of grief, had become something else. Not just a place of shelter, but of choice, of healing. Mesa wasn't just a runaway. She was family now. They still said little. But when the sun fell behind the horizon, each evening, they sat side by side on the porch. And the silence between them no longer weighed down like sorrow. It rested easy, like peace.